Bias is an inescapable component of the human experience. Everyone is different. Everyone's world is constructed inside their own minds, and we interpret our realities separately from one another. This means that we all come with our own bias. We bring our bias to any perception, any situation. Any new information that comes in is filtered through our understanding of that reality. Over the past centuries, much of human progress has relied on application of the scientific method in order to understand the world. And in seeking out the truth, we aim to observe, theorize, and test. In fact, the essence of the entire Suter text is that critical thinking, meaning a reasoned reflection, analysis, and evaluation, are fundamental to sound research. So, overcoming bias, coupled with solid research design and practices, are the two essential elements of ensuring that the work we do is important and, moreover, valid. In this presentation, I'm going to cover three areas of research bias that educational researchers should consider in the planning, execution, and interpretation of any research study. These three are cognitive biases, misinterpretations, and publication bias. First, let's take into consideration cognitive biases. These are subtle influences, personal beliefs, as well as natural tendencies of human beings. The work of Daniel Kahneman has been really important in uncovering and understanding the thought processes that people go through to make decisions and how fundamentally flawed we actually can be if we are not consciously aware of ourselves. So the biggest one that's always talked about that we really need to be aware of is confirmation bias. This means looking to validate a theory. So if you have a belief or an understanding of the way the world works, and then you're going to look for information that confirms that. On a practical level, this means you're going to surround yourself with people who believe as you believe. You're going to look for information that's going to be going to confirm an assumption or a hypothesis, in which case, as soon as you see it, you might stop looking. So that would be the first one. Second would be, closely related, would be inclusion bias or even exclusion bias. When you're comparing something that has changed in one situation or an experiment to another, that the inclusion of something else might be focused on as opposed to looking at something you're researching once again on the whole, coming back to it with a fresh set of eyes. So there are other things that where the experimenter, for example, can influence the experiment, such as Suter cited the case of Clever Hans, which would be, of course, the horse counting, which means there are environmental factors such as the experimenter influencing one of the people or the experimental group, or the placebo effect, which would be the power of belief. So if the subject in an experiment understands what the experiment is about, they might have an expectancy over an effect, which would actually then cause an effect or have a correlation therein. Also, things like intuition. We tend to trust our intuition over facts. And then, of course, the inherent flawed nature of self-reporting, or even selective attention and observation bias, the our inability to be objective in interpreting what we see. The second area of focus for educational researchers in seeking out and controlling for bias would be in misinterpretations. So looking for the results or finding results based on manipulation of data or cherry picking, or even creating or deleting data that is not that refutes an expected finding. So it's kind of related to confirmation bias, but in this case, it's looking for something that the data does not necessarily conclude overall, but just finding a specific conclusion within the data in order to make a finding more dramatic. And another big one is the Pygmalion effect or expectancy theory, and the importance here is that what one expects to find to happen tends to be focused on, as opposed to looking for results that contradict that bias or that belief. And the big one that is often most referred to, the Hawthorne effect, also known as the novelty or guinea pig effect, is that once a subject knows they're being experimented on, it tends to change their behavior. So that's another form of bias that we need to control for in the design of research. The final area is publication bias. In order to get a study published, it needs to be of some significance. In other words, the peer reviewers need to see that it's actually contributing to the body of knowledge in that area. And when the null hypothesis is confirmed, in other words, the results of the experiment are negative, those are generally not published, which means there's a lot of research that's been done that nobody knows about. It could contribute to better design of experiments in areas that may prove to be more impactful. This also contributes to the idea that researchers should focus on novel findings and may contribute to some of the other biases in terms of the misinterpretations. So it's also important, another one is outcome reporting bias, which is when published primary studies fail to include information covering all of the findings. In other words, they exclude some of the primary and secondary findings because they're not as sexy as one of them, that even if it was not one of the intended outcomes. So also the need to publish in academia can contribute to this. So finally, what can we do? Well, looking at everything through a sense of healthy, informed skepticism is a good start. Understanding and knowing all of these forms of bias exist and looking for telltale signs, much as Suter suggests through the work of Goldacre. And in short, these are things like looking for suggestions of causation where there really is only correlation. Think of the rooster crowing causing the sunrise. The use of too many independent variables for comparison. So ultimately, you're looking at apples and oranges, or ignoring dropouts or outliers, so removing them from the results of a study, or the opposite and focusing only on them in order to come up with a more dramatic finding, seeking out the needle in the haystack or finding a miracle, so to speak. Interpreting patterns among randomness, seeing shapes in the clouds, so to speak, or not considering external extraneous factors that may influence the outcome of an experiment or of research, such as something returning to normal over time or growing and developing over time, for example. And finally, allowing for politics, social factors to influence the interpretation. So not considering the context within which an experiment or a piece of research is being conducted. And Ioannidis recommends that basically we need better bias-free forms of controlled experiments. And this is another important point that Suter really reinforces throughout our course text, which is that we need more control in experiments and more randomization in order to, and basically better designed studies in order to test the many hypotheses that are out there. And ultimately, do more of those in order to refute. So more replication studies need to be done on a broader scale. And for each of us as we move on in this journey to become educational researchers, the most important thing I believe is to know yourself, to own yourself, to know who you are, to know what your bias is, where you come from, how you see the world, and to put that out there first, so that anyone interpreting your work can see that you are interpreting it through your lens. Objectivity is an impossibility, so lead with it. Actively seek to work against your natural instincts, your tendencies to lean towards your bias. And in every stage of research, actively seek to prove yourself wrong and look for opposing points of view that can ultimately inform better experiments, better questions, better research, and better interpretations that actually do contribute to the body of knowledge, to the literature.